Well, you have to put it in the context of Egyptian history, Egyptian Old Kingdom. That's the Pyramid Age. You have what is referred to as the Middle Kingdom. And this is often seen as the high point of Egyptian civilization. But around 1750, again, a period of turmoil where there is more than one rival for the rulership. And this is referred to as the second intermediate period, that we have the Hyksos. Now, the Hyksos, invaders of obscure race, marched in confidence of victory against our land. Finally, they appointed as king one of their number, whose name was Solitis, and then he briefly lists another 5 kings. These kings, whom I have enumerated above, and their descendants, ruling over the so-called shepherds, dominated Egypt, according to Manetho, so for 511 years, by which they should all depart, that is, all the Hyksos should depart from Egypt and go unmolested where they pleased. There they built in the land now called Judea a city large enough to hold all those thousands of people and gave it the name of Jerusalem. They're said to have worshipped the god Seth. What it seems to be is simply an Egyptian name for a Canaanite god, who may have been Baal. Now, there have been attempts to identify Moses or think that the figure of Moses might be related to an Egyptian, but Moses might have been based on this particular character.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true gnosis. Today I'm joined by Professor Lester Grabbe, retired American scholar, Emeritus Professor of the Hebrew Bible and Early Judaism at University of Hull, historian of ancient Judaism, authored several standard treatments, founded and convenes the European Seminar on Methodology in Israel's History. I'm very happy to have you here, and it is my pleasure to host you and ask you a question regarding the Hyksos, people of Egypt who came from abroad. For some people who have no idea what this is, who are the Hyksos? And we'll go from there.
Well, you have to put it in the context of Egyptian history. Just to give a very brief précis, we have Egyptian history starts about 3000 before the Common Era. And it was about that time that writing was invented. The Egyptians invented it using hieroglyphic writing. In Mesopotamia, they invented cuneiform. I think in China was about the same time, maybe Mesoamerica. But anyway, so Egyptian history starts what we call this historical period. Obviously, things happened before then, but that's usually referred to as the prehistoric. So about 3000, we have the beginning of the Old Kingdom, the Egyptian Old Kingdom. That's the Pyramid Age. It's the one we think of when we think of the pyramids of Giza and so on. And that lasted close to 1,000 years. It was getting toward 2000 before the Common Era that things developed sort of a period which is referred to by Egyptian sources as a period of chaos. Things were, instead of being ruled by one capital, one pharaoh, there were rival rulers. And this is called the first intermediate period. So, but beginning about 2000 or perhaps 2500, you have what is referred to as the Middle Kingdom. And this is often seen as the high point of Egyptian civilization. The language they used is seen as the classic one, some of the art and things like this. But the Middle Kingdom didn't last as long as the Old Kingdom did. But around 1750, 1750, before the Common Era, you have again a period of turmoil where there is more than one rival for the rulership. And this is referred to as the second intermediate period. So starting from about 1750 to about 1550, we have a 200-year second intermediate period. And it's during that time that we have the Hyksos. Now, the Hyksos, we didn't know much about them except what we found in an ancient writer up until the cuneiform language was, the cuneiform writing system was deciphered in the early 19th century. So for many centuries, all we had were what some classical writers said, but most of their information came from an Egyptian writer named Manetho. Now, Manetho wrote about 300 BC. He was an Egyptian priest, but he wrote in Greek. And his account of the various Egyptian history was picked up by other Greek writers who weren't Egyptians, and they quote him and use him. Now, Manetho's writing, unfortunately, wasn't preserved intact. So what we know of it is found in writers who quote him or using him, but we're not always sure we have his exact words, his exact text. And two of the main ones are Eusebius, the church father, and then another church writer, Julian Africanus, also quotes him. And then we also have the Jewish historian Josephus from the first century of the Common Era. And he quotes one long passage, which is mainly about the Hyksos and that period around there. He doesn't give a full account of Manetho, but he does quote him in a couple of places. Now, it's interesting because we have quite a lengthy section in Josephus, and he gives what we would call a narrative history. That is, he tells us various things about the Hyksos and so on. Which is a little bit different from what the other writers give about Manetho. All they do is give king lists. They list a king, maybe he was the son of so-and-so and he ruled so many years. And that's basically all they say. So Manetho's, Josephus' information looks different. It's almost as if he's using a different writer. But because we don't have the original Manetho, we don't know how he wrote his work. Did he just give bare king lists, or did he give more on each king, or did he sometimes give a lot and sometimes not very much? We just really don't know. But up until the 19th century, all we had was Josephus, really. He's the main writer, the main source. And I'd like to read you, it'll take a little bit of time, but it's worth knowing what he said about it, because this is what people depended on.
Yeah.
Now, he said he gives a king, and this is in his writing against Apion. He's writing against a writer who was anti-Semitic, or at least is regarded as anti-Semitic. And he's quoting Manetho in support of Jewish history. And he says, the king Tutimius, and then he says, in his reign, for what cause I know not, a blast of God smote us, and unexpectedly from the regions of the east, invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. This is Manetho supposedly telling about these invaders. By main force, they easily seized it without striking a blow. And having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. Finally, they appointed as king one of their number, whose name was Solitus. And then he goes on to describe some of the deeds of this king, which won't detain us, and then he briefly lists another 5 kings. So he lists 6 Hyksos kings. Then he says, these 6 kings, their first rulers, were ever more and more eager to extirpate the Egyptian stock. Their race as a whole was called Hyksos. That is, king shepherds, for Hyk in the sacred language, meaning Egyptian, means king, and sos in common speech is shepherd or shepherds. These kings whom I have enumerated above and their descendants, ruling over the so-called shepherds, dominated Egypt, according to Manetho. So for 511 years. Now, sometimes you don't quite know where Josephus is speaking and where Manetho is speaking, but he is supposedly quoting Manetho up until the time he says that, well, these shepherds ruled, that is, the Hyksos ruled for 500 years. Thereafter, he says there came a revolt of the kings of the Thebaid, that is the area around Thebes, the city of Thebes, and the rest of Egypt against the shepherds, and a fierce and prolonged war broke out between them. And he describes this for a while, and then he says that eventually a treaty was arranged by which they should all depart, that is, all the Hyksos should depart from Egypt and go unmolested where they pleased. On these terms, the shepherds, with their possessions and households complete, no fewer than 240,000 persons, left Egypt and journeyed over the desert into Syria. There they built in the land now called Judea a city large enough to hold all those thousands of people and gave it the name of Jerusalem. With our remotest ancestors, and this is obviously Josephus speaking, with our remotest ancestors, indeed, it was a hereditary custom to feed sheep. And as they lived a nomadic life, they were called shepherds. Such is Manetho's account, and if the time is reckoned according to the years mentioned, it is clear that the so-called shepherds are our ancestors. So he makes the claim that these Hyksos, which he translates as shepherds, are the ancestors of the Jews. And that was, as I say, the only real information we had up until the hieroglyphic writing was deciphered, really about almost 200 years ago.
Right.
So this is the information we have. Now, in more recent years, obviously we have the Egyptian inscriptions, and we also have archaeology. The trouble is that for the second intermediate period, we don't have much in the way of inscriptions that are very helpful. We have some inscriptions, but there are often things that say, well, King so-and-so built this and he did that, and you have a long passage that gives its titles and various other things, and the offerings he made. And when you end up finishing it, he hasn't really said very much that we would regard as history. That is, it's useful. He doesn't talk about events. So for the second intermediate period and for Hyksos rule, we don't have a lot of native material, not a lot of inscriptions from Egypt itself. We do have archaeology, though. There is, he's still alive, he's in his 80s now, an Austrian archaeologist, Manfred Bietak, who has been excavating what is thought to be the capital of the Hyksos for many years now, and he's written quite a bit on that. So we have the archaeology as well, which is helpful.
And where is that exactly, modern day?
It's a place called Tel El Daba, it's in the delta. It's sort of toward the south end of the delta where the Nile goes out into the sea. You have the delta area, which is a very large area where there are various mouths of the Nile, and of course they shift around and so on. But it would be somewhere in the area of Alexandria but I'm not. I'd have to look on the map to see how close it is to Alexandria. So it's in the northern part, not far from the sea, but not on the sea. The interesting thing is we refer to Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, but you have to keep in mind we're not talking about. It's the opposite of our north-south. So Lower Egypt is the northern part, and Upper Egypt is the southern part. And so anyway, he's been excavating there, and of course, from the archaeology, you can learn a lot about how people lived. You don't learn history about individuals generally, right, unless you find an inscription or something, but you do find about how people live. And they've also are able to infer a lot of things now that at one time they couldn't, because they have various tests they can apply. And they can find out about the things. And of course, if they find skeletons They have things like DNA analysis and so on that can be used. And of course, they have found skeletons in this area. So it's mainly from the classical sources like Josephus, some inscriptions, and then archaeology that we know about the Hyksos. But obviously, in the 200 years since hieroglyphs were deciphered, there's been a lot of speculation and a lot of work done on the Hyksos. Some of it is still quite unclear, and the second intermediate period is really it's still unclear. And this is not my specialty, so I can only repeat what the specialists say about it. But
Sure.
you find the specialists disagree over some fairly basic things. For instance, we know there are several dynasties. Dynasty is the British pronunciation, dynasty is the American. There are several that are in the second intermediate period, but we don't quite know how they relate to one another. We have the very end of the 13th dynasty. The first part is usually reckoned with the Middle Kingdom, and the second part with the second intermediate period. But it wasn't succeeded by the 14th, because the 13th has Thebes as the capital, and then the next one that has Thebes as the capital is the 17th. Now you ask, what about the 15th, 16th, the 14th, 15th, and 16th? And the 15th is the Hyksos dynasty, but it existed at the same time as apparently the last part of the 13th. It's a little unclear the exact timing, but it's parallel with the 13th and with the 17th. Now, the 14th is a little difficult. Some sort of don't want to even, say, well, maybe there wasn't a 14th. Others say, no, there was a 14th. It preceded the 15th. And some even think it had Canaanite kings as a rule. But and then the 16th, some discount entirely. So it's a bit of a problem even for specialist Egyptologists who specialize in chronology. Not all Egyptologists, of course, specialize in this sort of thing. But anyway, the 15th, there's agreement on that. It's the Hyksos, and it was ruling parallel with a dynasty at Thebes. And what happened, they think now, Josephus says there was an invasion. The Hyksos came in as invaders. And there's still one or two archaeologists who argue that maybe this is not completely wrong. But quite a few say there wasn't any invasion. What happened was you have Semitic peoples coming from the north, in other words, from Canaan, Canaanites, who were Semitic peoples. They came and settled in the Nile, and we do have evidence that a lot of people from Canaan and so on did settle in the Delta area, the northern part. And at some point, when turmoil developed around Thebes, the people who were living there coalesced and set up their own ruling dynasty. They didn't rule all of Egypt. Josephus implies that they took over the entirety of Egypt. Well, modern Egyptologists think that this never happened, but they only ruled in the northern part. But they did set up their own dynasty of rulers who were not native Egyptians, but who were probably Semitic and from the Levant being the area along the Mediterranean, meaning Palestine, Lebanon, and the southern part of Syria. The thing is that while the people who were in the Delta who settled there many of them were probably from Canaan, Bitok argues, and I think he's correct, he makes a good argument that the rulers of the Hyksos were not Canaanites, but were probably from further north. And he bases that on the fact that the architecture, and this is where archaeology comes into its own, it looks at the archaeology of the buildings, and finds that the architecture of the buildings is similar to that found in northern area of Levant, not in Canaan, but in areas like Byblos
Like
and even
Syria.
further north. Yeah, so he argues that the rulers were not from Canaan, but were from further north in the Levant. They were still probably Semitic,
Right.
still, and may have been related. And again, the relationship of these various peoples and so on is not always clear to us, and maybe it will become clearer as more DNA studies are done. But that's still in its infancy, as far as I can tell. So yes, the people in the Hyksos were probably Semitic peoples. They did come from, some of them probably from Palestine, further north, but they probably didn't come as invaders. They just came as settlers. During the Middle Kingdom, there were a lot of Semitic peoples in Egypt. Some were, of course, slaves. Had been enslaved at some point. But others came apparently and sold their labor. They were simply domestic servants and things like this. And then others, as I say, came and settled in the Delta region as settlers and mixed with whatever Egyptians were settled there. But the population seems to have been heavily Semitic at this time. So they coalesced into a sort of a semi-nation in that area. And now the thing about the name Hyksos, Josephus says it means shepherd kings, and that seems to be incorrect. We find that there is a term used in some of the inscriptions that refer to the Hyksos, and it was a term used in other inscriptions as well. It's a reference to kings of foreign lands, which in Egyptian is. The trouble is with Egyptian, we don't always know how it's pronounced. They wrote in consonants; they didn't have
Right.
vowels. But it's something like Haka, Hakut, and you can see how Hyksos came from that when the Greeks heard it, and maybe as it was also passed down over time. But it means kings of foreign lands. It doesn't mean shepherd kings. It has nothing to do with shepherds. So this is a mistake that Josephus passed on. Where he got it from, I'm not aware. He knew Egyptian, and so he simply passing on what he got. Whether Manetho said that seems unlikely, because Manetho would have known. He was able to read apparently the hieroglyphic inscriptions, but we can't know because we don't have his writing intact. So where they got the shepherd kings is a question, but it does mean they were kings of foreign lands, and so that's where the term Hyksos came from.
So, okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Finish your thought. Sorry.
Yeah, I think maybe I've given you something of an overview.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. This is.
He does also. They probably didn't rule for 500 years, as he says. He only named 6 kings, and in the various other king lists and other information from that period, we don't have really more than 6 kings. So most think they only ruled for about a century or so, the 15th dynasty. 6 kings don't generally rule for 500 years. So it was probably more like a century or a little bit more.
Yeah.
And so his 500 years is probably incorrect. He also says that they went and built Jerusalem. And again, Jerusalem, that we have some texts from an earlier period in Egypt, still the Middle Kingdom, called the execration texts. It's where they would curse your enemies. They would take a pot and they would write the names of the enemies on it and then break it. And some of these have been found, and all they are is just lists of names. But it's argued that the name Jerusalem is found on these, probably from, say, 1800 BCE, but it would be before the time of the Hyksos. Now, a scholar I know who, and I respect him, he's not an Egyptologist. He argues Jerusalem is not found in he thinks that's the wrong reading. Whether he's right or not, I don't know, but certainly some think Jerusalem is actually mentioned earlier than that. So his saying that the Hyksos founded Jerusalem is not likely. But once, the end of the story is that after ruling for about a century, the area of Thebes became stronger. It took over the control of the country, and they then attacked the Hyksos and drove them out. And this is what Josephus also says, as in the section I read. Well, this was the kings
Is that
of the
the 18th dynasty? I'm sorry. Would that be the 18th dynasty beginning right
no,
there?
this is still the 17th, but
Okay.
it's right at the very end.
Okay.
Now there's a ruler by the name of the second part of his name is Tau. It's Sekenenra Tau. His mummy has been found. He was maybe the last ruler of the 17th dynasty, but his mummy has been found, and it's found that he died a violent death. And some said, well, he may have died fighting the Hyksos. Now, I don't think we have any inscriptions of him or nothing that really tells us what he did or why he died or how. But a recent study looked at the wounds again and thinks that he may have been, yes, probably killed by the Hyksos, but perhaps it was an execution rather than killed in fighting.
Right.
But they may have captured him in fighting and then executed him ritually,
Right.
But his son was named Kamosa, and Kamosa was the last king of the 17th dynasty, and he then attacked the capital, which, as I say, was Tel El Daba, but the Hyksos, it was referred to as Avaris, at least in Greek. What the Egyptian was, I don't know, but in the Greek sources, it's referred to as Avaris. And he attacked it, and he took Avaris, and we actually have an inscription of one of the officials who apparently fought in that battle, and he claims to have captured some people, and the ones he captured then became his slaves. And so we actually have some record of that final battle. But first of all, they took Avaris and apparently drove out at least the rulers, who then went into southern Palestine in a place called Sharuchen. Again, this is in the Egyptian sources. And then the first king of the 18th dynasty, so Kamosa was the last of the 17th. The first king of the 18th is Ahmosa, and he then attacked Sharuchen and took it. And what happened after that, we really don't know. That at least I'm not aware that we have any certain information.
Interesting.
Sharuchen is, there have been several places that have been identified. They're not actually absolutely sure. Tel El Ajul is one place. There are areas around this in the southern part, anyway, southern part of what's now, of course, Israel, the Negev area, and
wow.
So the Hyksos. But the interesting thing is that the archaeology has found that most of the people didn't leave the area around Avaris, the capital. They've looked at the archaeology indicates that most people continued to live there. There wasn't any major cultural break. So it may be that only the upper class left. Maybe they were driven out and then left and settled and then were attacked, and who knows where they went after that. But the majority of people who were it was probably a mixture, as I say, of Egyptians and Semites who may be intermarried and so on anyway. They seem to have stayed there. So basically, we're talking about not an invading army coming in who settle and then are driven out, but instead we're talking about a group of people who were living there, who got control for a period of time and then lost it, but continued to live there and under the new rule, which again was a reunited Egypt under the 18th dynasty, which was a very important one, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And so that brings me to the next question, because now we're at the 18th dynasty,
yeah,
and I have a map that I just want to present. This is 1300 BC. I'm not sure how accurate this is, or if you
yeah,
agree with this or not. But the interesting part about this map is if you look at the Egyptian like land that they possess, there's Canaan right there. It's part of
that's right.
their territory.
Yeah,
Now, my question is, you get this the start of the 18th dynasty starts with a ruler named Amosa. Is that how you pronounce his name?
yeah, mostly, yeah.
Which is so I don't know if you can sort of some people might think that maybe that's the historical Moses, but the only problem with that is, isn't he doing the opposite? Isn't he fighting against the people in who are the Hyksos, or is that what do you think about that?
Sorry, I didn't understand the question. Is he against?
Is he fighting against the Hyksos? Is he
Oh,
driving them
yes,
out?
yes, he's fighting against the Hyksos.
So you can't really say that's the guy. So that's
No, that's
yeah,
no. There have been attempts to identify Moses or think the figure of Moses might be related to an Egyptian, but there are a couple of characters we know from the 18th dynasty that, and this is not something I've been particularly interested in, but uh, there are a couple that some have identified. There's more than one that might be Moses might have been based on this particular character.
sure,
Uh, but Moses, the name Moses is probably Egyptian in origin. In the biblical text, he's related. It gives a folk etymology. It says he's drawn from water, mayim in Hebrew,
right,
and that somehow Moses is related to water. But it is probably an Egyptian name and Egyptian origin. But quite a few of the kings have Moses as the last part, but again, that may not be what it was in Egyptian anyway. The Moses I think is often the Greek way
right,
of writing it, and so they are simply approximating it.
yeah,
But you're quite right that that Egypt controlled Canaan throughout the 18th dynasty. And there's not really a period because here we get into a separate question, which is a whole subject in itself, the Exodus.
right.
When would the Exodus taken place? Well, the point is there's no place for it.
Right. Well,
Because
that's what I was going to lead up to. This is
yeah,
actually, let me ask you this, because this will lead up right what you're about to say. The question would be: is it possible that this Exodus that these Hebrews are writing about centuries
mhm,
later, because they're not writing about it while it's happening, because it didn't happen,
yeah,
but centuries down the line when they're writing about this Exodus, are
mhm.
they remembering the split between Canaan getting independence from Egypt, and this is sort of an allegory, the Red Sea being the split between the two nations?
Yeah, there have been various proposals for what actually lies behind the Exodus. First of all, most of us are not willing to accept that several million people, which if you take the
Yeah.
biblical figures, 600,000 men of warrior age, plus women, children, old men.
Oh, and by the way, out of nowhere, they're in the middle of the desert, they're starving, they're thirsty, but then all of a sudden they go to war and they have battles and they win these battles.
Yeah,
Who's feeding these armies? Where are they
yeah,
making
yeah.
weapons? Who's doing all this? So yeah, this is obviously mythology, but I just wanted to point that out for anybody who doesn't. There's no archaeology for this. It clearly hasn't happened, which is why I asked the question: could this just be an allegory of Canaan, the end of this dynasty where Egypt has dominion over Canaan, and all of a sudden now they don't?
Uh, that's probably as good a suggestion as any. There have been several proposals. One is that, well, it wasn't a huge group of people who left, but it was a small group of
Sure.
escaped slaves who were pursued, and that is certainly possible. A friend of mine, Axel Knauf, argued that actually later on, where Israel is first mentioned, which is around 1200, which is about 500 years after the Hyksos. No, sorry, not. Yeah, I'm getting toward 500, but anyway, a pharaoh named Merneptah, who's right at the end of the 18th dynasty. Sorry, no, he's a 19th dynasty. There's a sort of a transition from 18th to 19th without a major break. But
Sure.
anyway, he mentions that he defeated Israel, and he's the first reference to the name Israel that we have anywhere. And so that's around 1200 before the Common Era. And my friend Axel Knauf argues that, well, he took captive some Israelites in his battle, and later on they were released. And this was then later, over a period of several centuries, was developed into the Exodus story, which is also plausible. But the thing is that one thing that we do know is that from the Egyptian records, the Egyptians were basically in charge of Canaan throughout this entire period. Now, it doesn't mean that they necessarily always had rulers on the ground or
Sure.
soldiers stationed on it, but they made expeditions there. They fought against the Canaanites, and sometimes they did have people on the ground. And so it was under Egyptian rule for a number of centuries there. And there's just simply no place for an exodus. And as you say, the Egyptian history, there's no place for a country to have been devastated by plagues. Of course, Egyptians had plagues and other things at various times, but nothing like would have happened with the plagues described in the book of Exodus.
Yeah, my other question would be, while the Hyksos were in Lower Egypt, which is also the north,
Yeah.
do we know much about which gods they worshipped, or what their sort of religion activities were?
We have some information on that, and I think Josephus may even, parts I didn't read, may have given some information. They're said to have worshipped the god Seth.
Mm,
That's the Greek form. It in Egyptian it's Shetech. I think is closer to the was. But anyway, he's an Egyptian god. But what it seems to be is simply an Egyptian name for a Canaanite god, who may have been Baal, and so they seem to have had the standard pantheon that we know of from the Ugaritic texts and others of Canaan. So, but we don't have a lot of detail. We just simply have names, and but it's certainly said that that was their chief god.
and when okay, I'm trying to remember, when was Akhenaten? Is right before this?
Akhenaten is around 13. I'm not sure I can give now. My mind goes blank.
Yeah,
Around 1300 BCE. He's the
yeah.
18th dynasty, and
Oh, wow. So this is right around that. This is sort of, contemporary of these events, and it's, I
well,
guess.
he's later than the Hyksos. Keep in mind, the 18th dynasty is quite a long one.
Right.
Uh, he's still several centuries after the Hyksos.
Sure, and that's a good point. But the reason why I asked that is because I think maybe he sort of popularizes the sort of monotheistic ideas, whereas the Hyksos were, if they're following customs of Semitic Ugaritic peoples, they would still be polytheistic in that sense. They wouldn't be
Yes.
monotheism didn't really happen yet. So,
No.
and the
No.
Seth thing is interesting because I talked to other scholars, like I'm David Litwell, for example, who points out that there was rumors that the Israelites had a golden idol of a donkey in the temple
Right.
in Jerusalem. Supposedly Antiochus the Fourth found it, or something along these lines. Or there's another story about Zechariah going in there and seeing it. But it's interesting because it almost sounds like there's a connection there. I mean, even though we're thousands of years apart, but still, what do you think about that?
Yeah. The information, the argument that it was Jews were worshippers of an ass that there was in the temple and so on. That was around, but that was in the Greco-Roman period. I'm not sure that it
Yeah,
goes back. Now is Manetho. The trouble is, again, we're in the question of what did Manetho actually write, but
right.
does he mention that? I can't remember that in the
Well,
who the Josephus refers,
the
but
only way to make that happen would you would have to connect Seth with this ass god, which is sort of a leap. But I think there's some depictions of Seth with that. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert, obviously, but I don't know if
he,
you know.
yeah, he comes across in some texts as almost a sort of a devil figure, but actually in ancient Egyptian religion, he's not. He's an enemy of Osiris,
Right.
but each of these represents also various things. Osiris represents death, and Seth represents certain natural phenomena that existed. It wasn't that he was considered bad. It was just he represents things like I think he has to do with the desert
Desert, yeah.
and other things that they experienced, and so he wasn't necessarily negative entirely in
He
Egyptian.
was the brother of Osiris too.
Yes, he was a brother. So these things develop, and he does become a more negative figure, I think, as time goes on.
Yeah, and another thing I wanted to point out is that I noticed on this particular archaeology, this is a Hezekiah in carving or whatever writing. But I
Yeah.
noticed the Egyptian symbolism on there, and what that lets me know is that this sort of we sort of like to separate Egyptian customs with Judaic customs, but I think that they sort of bleed into each other, and they sort of I think the Israelites are sort of like ancestors of the Egyptians in a way, right? Or what do you think about that?
Do you mean it the other way around? The Egyptians are
Yeah,
ancestors of the yeah.
yeah.
The Egyptians had influence because they were in contact. Throughout the New Kingdom, the 18th dynasty, by the way, and 19th of the New Kingdom in Egypt. But over the centuries, sometimes uh, Judah, Israel were closely connected with Egypt, and other times less so. So it depends. But we do have a period in the time of the monarchy where there seems to be quite a bit of Egyptian influence. For instance, the numbers that were used, and I think some of the measurements and so on were Egyptian, borrowed from Egypt. And so the symbolism you saw there of the is the same symbols that we find on some of the Egyptian scarabs and so on, and they were borrowed. Perhaps people didn't who borrowed them didn't fully understand the religious significance, but possibly they didn't care anyway. So you certainly have borrowings, and so Egypt has had an influence over the centuries, certainly.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, there was a scholar from the 19th century. This is going back. And I think
Mhm.
in the 20th century too. I think he was like right at the, 19th and 20th century in his
Mhm.
lifetime. And he was pointing out that the temples of Heliopolis were designed almost exactly the same as the Temple of Jerusalem, with like an inner holy of holies, and like you can see like the way it's laid out. He has the depictions of it in his book. I'm not sure if this is outdated or not. I'm not sure if you even know about this. Is this a thing or is this
I'm not
outdated?
sure about the Egyptian connection, but certainly it's generally agreed that the temple in Jerusalem was probably very similar in layout to temples known from the Phoenician area.
Hmm.
So, and it could be that even Egypt was influenced from Phoenicia because there was a strong connection over, even going back to the Old Kingdom to the third millennium BCE. with Byblos. There was trade. Egyptians got a lot of wood from Lebanon, which of course
Cedar.
was famous for cedar wood. So Byblos was a major trading partner of the Egyptians. And so it could be that they picked up things like that. I don't know. It's often, when you read about it, it's the other way around. The Byblos was influenced by the Egyptians, which they were, of course. But it works. It often works both ways.
Yeah,
So that is something I haven't. I don't have exact knowledge on. So I'm not sure I can answer that with any.
well, that's a good answer because what you're saying is actually makes a lot of sense because the Phoenicians are the ones that are trading and traveling. They're the ones
Yeah,
that have these nice boats, the triremes. They're trading purple. They have alphabets that are universal that people in Babylon know and people in Egypt know. People in Greece they know this alphabet. So they're sort of like the glue that holds everything together, and they trade amongst these empires. And it's not that surprising that Hebrew is based off the same alphabet that you have this like the Punic alphabet, or you sort of see
yeah,
how the Phoenicians sort of influence everybody in a little bit, but they're sort of borrowing from all the places that they're trading with.
yeah, yeah. They're important. The problem is that they we don't have a lot of inscriptions from Phoenicia, or the ones we do have are not don't tell us very much. But it's clear that the alphabet, as you say, was extremely important and gets picked up everywhere. It gets picked up by the Greeks. You look at the Greek, the or early Greek alphabet and the Phoenicians. It's very very similar.
Right.
Later, they, of course, become more separate. And modern Hebrew looks quite different from modern Latin alphabet, but they actually have a common origin. So,
Yeah. And the last thing I wanted to ask you about was Tacitus in Book 5.
mhm.
He sort of goes out in left field when he's talking about the Hebrews. He talks about them having a king named Hiroshima, and I guess that's the name of the city, Jerusalem. But he
Yeah,
also mentions that maybe they come from Crete. And he said, well, maybe not. Maybe they actually are from Egypt and they had an exodus. But I thought it was interesting that Tacitus is sort of. I guess my question would be: is Tacitus using a history that someone else brought forward, or is this like completely in its own league?
Tacitus, when he deals with Roman history, is quite good. He's a major historian, but uh, a lot of the Greco-Roman writers simply give you rumors and so on about the Jews. They don't really have exact information, and they don't have good sources either. No, I mean, even though the Hebrew Bible was available in Greek, no one read it. If they wanted to know about the Jews, they didn't go to the Jewish writings, even the ones in Greek. And this is one of the things that Josephus is frustrated by. He said, well, there's all this information about the Jews and people tell all these lies. But Tacitus is repeating, and I'd have to go back. I mean, I've read this myself, but I'm not. I couldn't at this point say precisely what he was writing and where he may have got it. But he again, he's like a lot of Greek and Roman writers. He simply repeats rumors and
Sure.
speculates and so on, and he's not very reliable about for information, except when he actually deals with Jews of his own time, where they relate to Romans and so
Right.
on. He obviously knows something about Jewish history, and he writes about the certain things relating to Palestine where he's very important. But
Yeah.
when he talks about origins and their beliefs and so on, he's really not very reliable.
That makes a lot of sense. And I just thought of something. Manetho, when he's writing, it's not too long after Alexander the Great and
Yeah,
the wars break out. And I'm wondering if there's any influence on because you look at his kings list, and he's got like Apollo is the king, and this for like 400 years, or whatever. It's sort of like a mythological king list for most of it. And I'm wondering, is he influencing is Hellenistic ideas influencing his king list a little bit, or do you think he's translating Egyptian into Greek, and that's just that way it comes out.
Uh, well, first of all, I don't think he's uninfluenced by the Greek side, but
Sure.
keep in mind that the Greek culture and so on was still fairly new at that time. So he learned Greek somehow or other, and but I think most of it he's probably getting from the Egyptian sources. But let's keep in mind that probably the Egyptians didn't always have. There were variant traditions within the Egyptian uh, material as well, I think. And we have in Mesopotamia about the same time as Manetho, we have Berosus, who again, a Babylonian priest who could read cuneiform and so on. But he gives sometimes his information, which has been discussed by Assyriologists. It agrees with one version that we find in the Babylonian or the Assyrian sources, but not always the only version that's given. And of course, the problem with Manetho is we don't always know when we have him, because when he gives names of, when he gives lengths of reign of kings and numbers, they're written using the Greek alphabet. They're not writing them out, Five, but he instead uses the character. For instance, the number 10 is the character iota. Well, scribes pass this on down. Scribes who don't know the material, they may misread it and read it some other way. And so a lot of these numbers you can't rely on, you can't be sure.
Sure.
But again, we don't know. We don't know, first of all, whether it's what Manetho wrote. And second of all, if it was what he wrote, how did he do it? He may have been figuring things out and made mistakes, calculating stuff on his papyrus or whatever, and then simply failed to carry the number he should or whatever.
Exactly.
So it's like his 511 years. Well, that's what Josephus says. He says, does Josephus actually? Where did Josephus get that number? I'm not sure that Eusebius. That's the number he gives. I think it may be different. And so, these things are. This is what Egyptologists wrestle with, and
Right.
they still use Manetho because he divided everything up into 30 dynasties. They still use him, but they try to correct him and find him very frustrating at times.
Yeah, and I noticed that he's sort of, I don't know, I'm not sure if he's the one who they get the idea that Alexander is the son of Nectanebo or not, but I also noticed that in Luxor there's these giant depictions of Alexander going into the Oracle of Ammon and Siwa Desert and
Mhm.
becoming the son of Ammon. When did that get put up? Is that right around the same time?
That actually that goes back to the time of Alexander himself.
Okay.
He made our information on Alexander is from a Greek writer named Arrian. Now Arrian is writing in about the second century of the Common Era, but
Right.
he has very good sources, and so he's generally reliable about Alexander. But he says that Alexander went to this oasis. I forget why he wanted to go there, but he knew about it. And supposedly he came back and it had been confirmed that he was a descendant of the god and so on. So, but it probably may have, some of that originated with Alexander himself,
Right.
probably. What exactly he was told, we don't know. He was the only one there. But what he passed on is a different matter.
And speaking of, this is the last thing I promise. Speaking of Ammon, the word I'm just this. Forgive me for sounding like a complete amateur right now, but do we have any idea of where the word "amen" comes from?
Yes,
Okay.
it's, I mean, it's a Hebrew word. It's a normal Hebrew word. Let it stand, let it be. Ammon, no, I think it's just accidental that they sound somewhat similar.
Are you
Uh,
familiar with Plutarch when he talks about how they use the god Ammon to invoke the invisible?
I may have read it. I know Plutarch has a very interesting passage where he has three people debating the beliefs of the Jews, and he actually describes certain things about the Feast of Tabernacles, which shows someone had observed. They didn't get it directly from the Jews, because he said, well, they go in the temple and then we think they worship Dionysus there, and with wine and so on, but they're obviously speculating at that point. But
Right.
he has some good information about up to that point, showing someone who's not a Jew is observed and has described his observations, but then speculates about what it means. But I don't remember the what he says about Ammon. I'm sorry.
Well, it's in the book called On Isis and Osiris,
Oh,
and
right.
he
Yeah.
says that the god Ammon, or no, he says the word Ammon is
Right.
used by Egyptians when invoking the invisible. And right away when I read that, I said, "Oh my God, is that Amen?" Because there's no vowels in Hebrew or
Yeah.
Egyptian, just Amen, right?
Yeah. No, the Ammon was a major Egyptian god.
King of the
So
gods.
yeah. So, but no, I don't think there's any connection with Amen. I think it's just accidental that
Sure.
they sound similar. Right? It's one of those things that that may sound plausible, but until you examine it, you don't know.
And Plutarch could be
There could
wrong
be a
too.
connection, but once you then examine it further, I think it's, at least to my mind, it's unlikely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because then you look at the actual word Amen. I mean, because so be it. Wouldn't there be words in Hebrew that actually say "so be it"? Like, isn't that sort of isn't it? Doesn't it become sort of like a uh, how do you say it? Isn't it like becomes that like? Can it become that definition, or is it actually mean the etymology actually means "so be it"? Like literally.
Oh, it's a verb.
That's what.
It's a fairly common verb. It's
Yeah.
not unusual. No.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. That's just one of those things that I thought was interesting, and it's people like to talk about it on the internet. So I want to set the record straight a
Yeah.
little bit.
The word Ammon does occur, but it's probably not the same as the god. But there has been speculation of what it means. It occurs in Proverbs 1 to 9. I don't remember the exact place, second or third chapter, and as I recall, and it has to do with the figure of wisdom. And this word appears, which is the only place it occurs, I think, in the biblical text. And I don't think it's a Hebrew word. I think it's borrowed. I hope I'm not misleading you here, because I haven't looked at it for a long time. But it seems to be, so there might be some connection there, but
Hmm.
not with Amen, I don't think.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll admit it is a stretch, but
Yeah.
this has been great. Learned a lot from this. I'm really glad to meet you, and hopefully we can do this again sometime. Is
Right.
there any books coming out that you want to tell people about, or any links that you want to tell people about?
Well, I have a book coming out. It's not aimed primarily at the general readership, but I'm sure there are many people who would be able to read it without any difficulty. It's called The Dawn of Israel, which is in the press at the moment. I'm expecting proofs anytime. It'll probably be out in the autumn.
Nice.
But the subtitle is the Land of Canaan in the Second Millennium BCE.
Wow.
But
It's gonna.
it looks at it, but it does cover this period, the second millennium, and I even start a little bit with the third, but mainly the second millennium. And I do have information on the Hyksos and but mainly looking at it. Where do we find Israel? That's my main interest.
Yeah,
Do we
that is a
find
good
it? Yeah.
question. I definitely would like to have you back on it, explore that a little bit more when we get closer to the release of your book, and then we can, you know, get that going too. So, but
Right.
yeah, it's been my pleasure. And like
It's
I
mine
always say,
too. Thank you very much.
you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.